This talk is about Martin Luther King and crisis, and I'm looking at Martin Luther King's famous speech, I Have a Dream. I'm giving background on I Have a Dream, and then at the end, I'm talking about how this responds to crisis. The title is How Samuel Smith and a Parade of Anthem Lovers Created the Conclusion of I Have a Dream. Martin Luther King's refusal to extemporize. People often misconstrue the conclusion of I Have a Dream. This is how that happened. Martin Luther King's aide, Clarence Jones, handed copies of I Have a Dream to reporters hours before King delivered I Have a Dream. So on the day of the speech at the March on Washington at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., Clarence Jones, there's a big crowd. Clarence Jones hands out the prepared text of the speech, of King's speech, to the reporters earlier in the day. When King, who's the last speaker on the occasion of a long day with a lot of speakers, King, during this speech, he occasionally looks down at the copy of the speech that he's holding in his hand. About 2/3 of the way through the speech, however, he stops looking at the paper and he veers away from the contents that are printed on the paper that he has in his hand, which is the same as what the reporters had in their hands. So reporters and certain historians concluded that King must have extemporized his conclusion. One of them was Taylor Branch, who won the Pulitzer Prize for his book about King called Parting the Waters. This idea that King extemporized the conclusion has spread around to enough people that one scholar even says that King famously extemporized the conclusion. But I'm here to tell you that did not happen. The process of composing the conclusion of I Have a Dream actually began in 1831, not right on the spot. As Drew Hansen explains in his excellent book called The Dream, King pulled from his memory a conclusion that he had used fairly often in his own previous speeches. More importantly, long before King was born, people were composing I Have a Dream. They started in 1831. Samuel Smith, in that year, wrote America. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. You're probably familiar with that song. He wrote the song in 1831. The song, the refrain of the song concludes with, land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside let freedom ring. I will spare you any more of my singing. You don't have to listen to any more of it. Note that in the lines from every mountainside let freedom ring, Samuel Smith coins a metaphor. He equates freedom with a bell that can ring. Freedom is a bell, let freedom ring. Freedom is like a bell, and it can ring from a mountainside. That's the metaphor that Smith coins in the song America. After 1831, the controversy about slavery heated up in the United States, and abolitionists were crusading to try to eliminate slavery. They loved the song America. It doesn't mention slavery, but they loved it. And they included in two popular anti-slavery hymnals. A lot of African Americans favored America and they taught it to their school children. During the Civil War, this song flourished so much that people call it, quote, as indispensable and as common as sunshine. As indispensable and as common as sunshine. African American soldiers sang it during the Civil War. For example, when they were celebrating the implementation of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. The popularity of the song stemmed from its celebration of freedom, the concept of freedom, which is a sacrosanct term, and it's a hallowed concept in American culture. In American culture, whatever you're proposing, it has to be promoting freedom. You can never say anything against the idea of freedom, right? You can say somebody misunderstands freedom, but this is what freedom really means. Okay. After the Civil War ended in 1865, people continued to like this song. And in 1893, Ida B. Wells, who was a famous anti-lynching crusader, she slightly altered Smith's words at the conclusion of her most famous speech, Lynch Law and All Its Phases. The conclusion of this speech is, "My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside freedom does ring." You will notice that Wells repeats Smith's metaphor, equating freedom with a bell that can ring from a mountainside. 1893, her anti-lynching speech. In 1939, Marian Anderson was a stellar African American singer, and she protested racism by giving a concert at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. She was supported by the NAACP and by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. 75,000 people came to the concert, and Marian Anderson's microphone carried the concert into radios across the entire nation. 1939, people listened to her concert on their radios across the nation. 75,000 people on a national mall is a large number. This was a big, big event. 1939. In 1944, when Martin Luther King was 15 years old, he gave a speech that has survived. We still have this speech that recalls Anderson's concert and mentions her singing of America. "My country 'tis of thee." She sang the song at the concert. Anderson's rendition includes the words, "From every mountainside, let freedom ring." Now, going to 1952. From 1939, Anderson's concert. 1944, King at age 15 mentions the concert and Anderson singing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" at the concert. 1952, King's friend Archibald Carey, who is a African Methodist Episcopal minister in Chicago, gave a speech at the Republican convention in Chicago in 1952. Carey ends his speech by quoting America. "My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring." Carey does something a little bit different, though, from Ida B. Wells. Carey adds some sentences that seem to extend the lyrics. So after he quotes the lines that I just recited, he extends the lyrics and extends and enhances and strengthens Smith's metaphor by enumerating specific mountains. These specific mountains show up in Carey's speech, but they didn't show up in Samuel Smith or in Ida B. Wells. So Carey says, "From every mountainside, let freedom ring." Not only from the Green Mountains and White Mountains of Vermont and New Hampshire, not only from the Catskills of New York. Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain in Georgia, from the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. Note that, like Ida B. Wells, Carey reiterates Smith's metaphor that equates freedom to a bell ringing on a mountain, and then he extends the metaphor by citing specific mountains that the bell is supposed to ring on. Here is King and I Have a Dream, the conclusion of I Have a Dream. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside let freedom ring. Let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. You will notice how similar this is to Carrie. Let freedom ring from the mountains of New Hampshire, mountains of New York, etc. And Carrie also mentions Stone Mountain of Georgia, which King mentions. King adjusts the list of mountains. He changes them around some, but he got this idea from Carey, and he got the conclusion directly from Carey. He borrows the conclusion directly from Carey's speech. But he knows that there's a lineage behind this. He knows that Marian Anderson sang this song at the concert she gave at the Lincoln Memorial in 1939, because he mentioned that when he was 15 years old in a speech he gave in 1944. So King is delivering his speech, I Have a Dream, on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, the exact same spot where Marian Anderson had performed her concert in 1939. King is in 1963, right? So Anderson 1939, King in 1944, mentions Anderson, Archibald Carey 1952, and then King doing I Have a Dream in 1963. Like Wells and like Carey, King seized and repeated King Smith's metaphor, equating freedom to a bell that could ring on a mountainside. And like Carey, he repeats the elaborated list of mountains. He changes them some, but he's got the same idea of repeating the mountains and appearing to extend the lyrics of Smith's song. So, who composed the ending of I Have a Dream? Number one, it was not extemporaneous. King had given the same ending before in his own speeches. And the process of composition starts with Samuel Smith and goes on through these other orators. And there are probably other ones that didn't get their speeches into print who have fairly similar kind of conclusions. So Smith originates the metaphor equating freedom with a bell that would ring on a mountainside. King recapitulates this metaphor, but after Smith and before King, the abolitionists and the soldiers helped enshrine America in the national consciousness. In 1893, Wells inserted Smith's lyrics into her conclusion. 1939, Anderson reignited the lyrics at her protest at the Lincoln Memorial. 1952, Carey comes along. As I mentioned, in 1963, King adjusts Carey's list of mountains. All these people together created the conclusion of I Have a Dream. They all created it together. King does not extemporize. Why does he not extemporize? Well, one reason is he wants to foolproof his speech. He wants to foolproof his conclusion. He doesn't want to get up there and blow it. He doesn't want to get up there and depend on last minute inspiration. He's standing in front of a crowd of 250,000 people. He's got TV cameras from broadcasting his speech across the whole nation. There are cameras from other countries in the world broadcasting the speech. Now, would you get up there and just make something up on the spot? Probably not. Right. He wants to foolproof the speech. He wants to use material that he has road tested before himself, and it's also road tested earlier by Archibald Carey. Now, I'm going to the crisis. Okay, the crisis. There's a civil rights protest started anew with Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat on the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. And after that, we have the Montgomery bus boycott that lasts until 1956. In 1957, there's a Little Rock school crisis, and there's the Little Rock Nine integrating the high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. Then there's a lunch counter sit-ins in Greensboro, North Carolina, and across the South. And there's a freedom rides across Mississippi and Alabama. And all these incidents are part of the civil rights movement, this nonviolent resistance to segregation. It continues, this movement, this resistance continues with James Meredith at Ole Miss in 1963 and with Birmingham in the spring of 1963. So there's a lot going on. The segregationists are arguing that these people, these protesters, are creating all this trouble. They're upsetting our way of life. They thought segregation was a permanent institution, a permanent arrangement. So they thought it couldn't change. And they thought, what are these people doing demonstrating? And they're not supposed to be doing that. And they're upsetting us. That's what the segregationists thought in the South. They said that the crisis was the civil rights movement creating this uproar and protesting in the streets and getting people arrested to resist segregation. King defines the crisis differently. At the beginning of I Have a Dream, King lauds the Emancipation Proclamation. He praises and salutes the Emancipation Proclamation. He says the Emancipation Proclamation came 100 years ago as a great beacon light of hope. It came as a joyous daybreak after our long night of captivity. He's celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. But, he adds, 100 years later, he's talking on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. He's talking in 1963, Emancipation Proclamation is 1863. So he says, but 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. What? We had the emancipation. 100 years later, the Negro is still not free. The Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. The manacles of segregation, the chains of discrimination, those are images from slavery. He's saying segregation equals slavery. It's another form of slavery. That's his metaphor. That's his comparison. That's his equation. So in some sense, he is defining the racial crisis of 1963 as a continuation of the crisis of slavery before and after 1863. He's saying it's the same crisis. The crisis is slavery / segregation. The crisis is not that I am practicing Gandhian nonviolence and being willing to go to jail in order to highlight the injustice of segregation. The crisis is segregation itself as a continuation of slavery. He also defines the civil rights movement of 1963 as an extension of abolitionists' earlier appeals to symbols of American patriotism, such as Samuel Smith's America. He does this in other places in the speech. He quotes Jefferson words in the Declaration of Independence in I Have a Dream. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. He quotes all men are created equal in I Have a Dream. So he's trying to use these touchstones of American patriotism and American democracy in order to indict segregation, in order to call for racial justice, in order to affirm the importance of racial equality, and in order to call for change, to get rid of segregation. He's saying basically, if you believe in my country 'tis of thee, if you believe all men are created equal, you have to get rid of slavery. You have to get rid of segregation too. He also, like the abolitionist, quotes the Bible. He uses the Bible as a touchstone against slavery. Abolitionists quoted the Bible as an authority that they used to attack slavery. He quotes the Bible and I Have a Dream as a way to attack segregation. For example, he says, "We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." That's a quotation from the book of Amos in the Hebrew scripture. Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. So he's saying the Bible indicts segregation. If you believe in the Bible, you need to get rid of segregation. This is similar to what abolitionists did. Through these decisions, he rebuts the segregationist opponents who are claiming that the civil rights movement is a crisis. He responds by placing African American protests, including the March on Washington, where he delivered I Have a Dream, at the end of a large historical panorama that starts with biblical history, the book of Amos, for example, and encompasses American slavery and subsequent American history. In contrast to his opponents, he defines the crisis as the long-standing denial of freedom and equality to African Americans. This is the crisis. You deny us equality while you use the language of equality in the Declaration of Independence and in the song America. He explains the crisis is not new, but rather continuous. Who cares? Why does this matter? Am I just giving you a history lesson here? It matters. Why? It matters for us today. It's not only a history lesson I'm trying to give here. By falsely claiming that King improvised his conclusion and he extemporized it, writers help to monumentalize King as an inspired, larger-than-life genius. Their idea of King, which is wrong, is that King just got up there and, magically the words came to him. There was this magical speech that just came out of the air because he's such a larger-than-life genius. By investing so much authority in King while ignoring his reiteration of abolitionist appeals, the nation seriously diminishes the entire centuries-old African American struggle. The African American struggle started during slavery. It continued after slavery. It continued in the decades between slavery and Rosa Parks. The nation, by claiming that King is extemporized, erases Archibald Carey, and it erases Marian Anderson, and it erases Ida B. Wells. Oh, it all was King. These people weren't on TV, but that doesn't mean they don't count. They're important. They count. They matter. King drew on them. King is using their appeals by erasing all these abolitionist orators, the African American soldiers, Ida B. Wells, Marian Anderson, Archibald Carey. People will learn to learn. The erasure of these people teaches the public to yearn for another inspired, larger than life genius. Oh, we need another genius who can give a speech, a magical speech out of nowhere. A lot of people yearn for such a leader. Why don't we have somebody like that anymore? I've heard people, I've been researching and teaching King for a long time. People tell me that all the time. If people keep yearning for such a genius, they will fail to generate the multi-generational grassroots protests that we need now to stop global warming, to stop income inequality, and to overcome racial injustice. The progress made in the civil rights movement occurred because of it was the largest mass movement for human rights in American history. It occurred because of the strength of the mass movement. One person does not symbolize the mass movement. To understand the mass movement, you need to understand group dynamics, not one person. One person doesn't explain a mass movement because a mass movement operates according to group dynamics. And in this case, King is operating according to these traditional appeals that he's drawing on. If we can understand that, we can understand something about the success of Martin Luther King, the success of I Have a Dream, and we can overcome the mythology that I believe is a crippling mythology. Thank you.